Welcome to Crop Talk, brought to you by Innovative Ag Services, and this is our Field Scouting Special. Each week from March through October, our agronomy team shares timely, boots-on-the-ground updates from across the IAS geography, so you can make confident decisions as the seasons change. Today, you'll hear a quick regional update from our IAS agronomists, including what we're seeing in the fields right now, what to keep an eye on next, and a few practical scouting reminders you can put to work this week. I'm your host, Nicholas Giesman, and we're going to get things started by a little update from Ellsworth, so I'm going to send it over to Nick.
Thanks, Nicholas. This is Nick Thompson from the Ellsworth location, covering Story County, Hardin County, and Hamilton County. Pretty basic update here today. We've had planters in the field for the past week or so until we got rained out. Right now, my biggest watch out is going to be we are well ahead of our year-to-date average on rain. So those guys who stabilized your nitrogen in the fall and the spring, you should see good return on that investment there. And as we get further into the season, we want to make sure that those low spots aren't just collecting water and letting it sit. If you have those low spots and you can identify them now, there might be something you can do. Otherwise, make sure that you know your fields, know the topography, and know where the water's going to sit. One thing I've noticed while I've been out scouting has been the weed presence has definitely stepped up as of recent. If you didn't have a burn down pass planned, you might want to take a look at some of your fields and maybe get with your agronomist and see if a burn down is something that you may need. Next, I'm going to pass it over here to our Northwest region and Owen over in Cleves.
Thanks, Nick. This is Owen Heatland out of the Cleves office, covering Hardin, Grundy, Butler, and Franklin counties. As been stated, we've been pretty wet the last few days. Last week allowed some guys to get into some planting. Seen some corn go in the ground and some beans go in the ground. I would estimate both between 5 and 10% planted acres in this area. While some guys haven't planted any corn and only beans, the reverse is true as well. So just not a lot done, very wet. As we go into this week, we will see colder temperatures move back in through Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then warm up start to happen. So I would be a little cautious of making sure we're planting into good conditions. That means dry conditions, no sidewall compaction. And as the ground begins to warm up, we'll see those things fix themselves. The other thing that I've noticed as I was out scouting this weekend was the emergence of a lot of grass. We've talked about in the last couple episodes some of those winter annuals, cockleburr, ragweed, pennycress, but I've really started to see the grass emerge, which will necessitate adding Roundup to your mix or atrazine or something of that nature if you're burning down. Later, me and Nicholas can dive a little deeper into that, but that's what I've got for an update now. Next, I'll kick it east to Aaron.
Thank you, Owen. I'm Aaron Recker out of the Masonville location. I cover Buchanan, Delaware, and parts of Fayette and Clayton County. Last week, there were a handful of guys out in the field getting field work done. Some guys even got the planters out to test to make sure everything was going good. There are a handful of growers that have some crop in the ground, but those are the guys that didn't get much rain. We were able to get some burn down sprayed over the weekend before the weather came in on Monday. So now we're just waiting for those fields to dry out again so we can get back out there. A quick tip is water hemp starts to germinate around 350 GDUs, and we're getting close to that threshold. So making sure we're out scouting fields and checking the weeds and weed pressure to make sure we have the right chemical and correct rates in the tank when we go out to spray is very important. As always, call your local agronomist with any questions. We would be happy to help. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Adriana in our Southeast region.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm Adriana Herlash. I cover Jones County and parts of Delaware County in the Southeast region. This week is a good opportunity to finish up anhydrous as we start to dry out and get back into fields. We aren't to the point yet where we need to consider maybe changing up our nitrogen plans if anhydrous isn't going to get finished, but that time will be here before we know it, so just keep it in the back of your mind as we move forward. And when we get to that point, that is something you can discuss with your agronomist. As things keep progressing and warming up, looking at wrapping up dry fertilizer hopefully this week and continuing spraying beans and corn pre's with nitrogen. Along with that, Aaron, Nick, and Owen said, we're already seeing weeds coming up and reaching 4 to 6 inches tall. If your pre-pass hasn't been applied yet, now is the time to touch base with your local agronomist and consider maybe bumping up those rates or adding some different chemicals in. This spring so far has been the optimal growth of weeds, If you see a weed or an issue that you aren't sure about, please reach out and we'll try to meet with you in the field and go over what plan needs to be set in place to help alleviate any issues you are having or seeing. We are here to help you in any way possible, so don't be shy to reach out with any concerns you may have. Thank you, and I'm going to kick it back to your host, Nicholas.
Thank you very much for that update, Adriana. As everybody kind of said, it sounds like we're very wet here. I think we could do for a little dry spell to get everything dried out back in the fields. Owen, I think you've heard this before. Farming, you can't just have one plan. You got to have a plan B, C, and D. I think we're kind of rolling into that with our pre's and our burn downs. Now's the time to be into plan B, plan C, where we're adding that Roundup and whatever adjuvants that go along with that to control these grasses that are coming up. Are you seeing the same thing, or what is your thoughts?
Yep, I would agree. Whether you're going to do burn down or do tillage, even in the acres that are going to get tillage, you're really starting to see the grass grow and explode. So making sure you've got that tillage tool set correctly to take the grass out, or if it gets bad enough, try and burn it down before you do a tillage pass. And then anytime you're looking at grass, we're looking at maybe a little different than what our plan had been, whether we're using a 2,4-D or a dicamba. With grass, we really need either Roundup, or if it's really small, we can get away with the atrazine or some sort of HPPD in the mix. But when we add either of those products, we've got to have some form of AMS, whether that's liquid, dry, some form we need to add to that mix to get good burn down capabilities out of that. And then, just remember, we want to try and be above 50 the night before we're spraying, so we get good growth out of that material so it absorbs and accepts that herbicide.
Oh, and have you seen people, a lot of this grass, everybody always says it's around the waterways, it's the edge of fields. What are your thoughts on going out and spraying, the outside 90 feet or 120 feet of fields to clean that grass up and then maintain your plan A, if you will, on the rest of those acres? Or do you just see it beneficial to jump into, if we're throwing Roundup at the tank, I'm going to spray the whole acre?
There's two different ways to look at that. I would say definitely for sure you want to border your fields, but obviously there's a big variance of what I have for fields over here in central western Iowa to what you have for fields in Jackson County. Sometimes by the time you border the field, you sprayed almost the whole field. The second part of that scenario is if you truly get out and walk, don't ride the field. If there's grass coming next to the waterway that you can see from the road, there's grass coming in the middle of the field that you can't see from the road. So if you're going to do no-till, then you probably need to consider some sort of burn down on the whole acre. Now, if you're not going to do no-till, but the grass along the edges is really, really bad, that may necessitate Roundup in that outside border pass and then the normal herbicide in the rest. So it's a scenario by scenario look, and you kind of just got to discuss with your agronomist what's going to be the best case for you.
I would agree with that. And I know with changing your herbicide programs here, a big topic is always, we're talking about weed size, we're talking about adjuvants. I think one thing that kind of gets missed is always nozzles. So, as you change your herbicide program, or if you're changing from your program last year, make sure you have the correct nozzles on, because that makes a world of a difference to getting control.
That's a great point, Nicholas. Roundup, 2,4-D, dicamba are all products that don't necessarily require coverage. So you can use a more, shall we say, aggressive nozzle that will have bigger droplet sizes. And if you get a little on the plant, you're okay. But if you're starting to rely on an HPPD or an atrazine in the mix to get your burn down, you're going to have to get a little better coverage. And most of the time you're talking about smaller weeds. So that may change a little bit what you use for the nozzle in the pre-pass, depending on what you have in the tank.
I know one conversation we're having, which I'm sure everybody is right now, is you start seeing May 1st at the end of the week here, when and when not to plant. I think we're all kind of in the same boat. It's wet and it's cooling down. In your eyes, what's the ideal? Do you wait till it warms up here over the weekend to really get going? Or as soon as you can go, is it worth putting seed in the ground?
I would say the biggest thing is I don't look so much at the calendar or temps. You look at soil temp, and then you look at what is the soil telling me? Because even though the calendar may say May 1st, there's no need to mud that crop in. And what I mean is there's no need to cause sidewall compaction or tomahawk roots, because once that happens, you're not fixing it the rest of the year. So we still have plenty of time. As the calendar goes, we can still raise great corn and soybeans, even for planting a couple more weeks yet. So the biggest thing I would say is look at your fields. Maybe you pick a pattern tiled field first, something that's going to dry out, maybe something that's got lighter soil, and just make sure that you're doing a good job, not only when you're planting, but when you're doing tillage. We don't want to be creating clods out there. We don't want to create problems because those problems will follow us for the rest of the year. So I know it's hard to sit and wait, but that's probably the most important thing is soil conditions more so than temp and calendar. Ideally we'd want to start planting when the soil temp is 50 degrees and rising, but I would much rather plant into a 48-degree soil that's good and fit than a 55-degree soil that's muddy and going to create issues.
I would second that. I think we've kind of hit the nail on the head with that a couple times of making sure our soil is in the right condition to go, not just looking at a calendar date or, hey, my soil temp says it's go time. It's what is your field telling you? What is your soil telling you? And is it time to go, or is it better to wait another 12 to 24 hours?
One last thing I want to bring up is Adriana made a good point about, changing nitrogen. But the other thing is guys will get nervous and start to ask about changing seed. I really don't know that there's a big issue to even begin to think about changing maturities until we get into probably the 20th of May or maybe even a little bit later. Maybe you look at your latest number and make sure you get that planted first or close to first, but we still got a long time before we even start to think about doing any of that.
Thank you, Owen, for all that good information there. Those last little tidbits on waiting on, changing maturities. There is a lot of time left. So that's it for this week's Crop Talk by IAS. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Nicholas Kiesman. We'll see you next week. That's all for this week's Crop Talk by IAS. Thanks for tuning in. If any of our listeners have questions, feel free to email them to croptalk@innovativeag.com. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe so you don't miss next week's update. And if you know a fellow grower who'd value a quick field snapshot, share this episode with them. For more agronomy resources and to connect with your local IAS team, visit innovativeag.com and follow Innovative Ag Services on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We'll catch you next week on Crop Talk.